December 20th, 1944, Luxembourg City. The telephone crackled and hissed as General Omar Bradley pressed the receiver to his ear, his hand clenching so tightly his knuckles turned white against the black bakelite. On the other end of the line came Dwight Eisenhower's steady voice, calm and measured, delivering instructions that would push their hard-won friendship right to the edge of collapse. The Supreme Commander was placing two entire American armies, the 1st and the 9th, under British command, under Montgomery's command. Bradley couldn't hold it in anymore. His Missouri drawl gave way to raw fury. "By God, Ike, I cannot be responsible to the American people if you do this. I resign." The response came back cold and steady. "Brad, I am the one responsible to the American people, not you. Your resignation therefore means absolutely nothing." There was a pause. Bradley made one final protest, his voice hollow now, then went silent. This moment, swallowed up in the turmoil of Hitler's Ardennes offensive, captured something essential: 3 years of building American resentment toward a British field marshal who seemed convinced he alone possessed the skill to win this war. Bernhard Law Montgomery, victor of El Alamein, the hero who had saved Britain, had become the central figure dividing the Allied command. Yet beneath all the fury and frustration lay a darker question that echoed through American headquarters from North Africa all the way to Germany. How could an alliance fighting for its very survival against Nazi barbarism find itself fractured, not by German resistance, but by the outsized personality of a single man? The answer wasn't hidden in one dramatic clash, but scattered across countless moments, disagreements, and confrontations that had started in the North African desert and now played out in the mud of Northwest Europe. This was the story of how exceptional talent became a liability, how national pride collided with the demands of coalition warfare, and how American officers came to regard their most famous British battlefield commander with feelings ranging from deep frustration to something that bordered on contempt. The numbers told a straightforward story, though the politics behind them were anything but simple. By late 1944, American forces filling European theaters far outnumbered their British counterparts. American factories were churning out weapons and supplies on a scale Britain's war-exhausted economy simply couldn't match. Yet Field Marshal Bernhard Law Montgomery seemed unable or unwilling to acknowledge these realities or adjust his approach based on them. Through American eyes, Montgomery embodied everything they'd broken free from during their revolution: the arrogance of aristocracy, the smugness of colonial power, and an unshakable conviction in British superiority. Yet Montgomery was no mere caricature or stereotype. He possessed genuine brilliance. He planned operations with meticulous care. He guarded his soldiers' welfare in ways that built deep loyalty among his troops. His battle victories were substantial and real. His understanding of tactics was sharp and sophisticated. British troops, hammered by failures in the early years of war, had discovered in Montgomery a commander who delivered wins while keeping casualty counts reasonable. Churchill treasured him. The British population celebrated him. None of it mattered to American commanders who found themselves constantly pushed aside, talked down to, and publicly belittled by a field marshal who clearly viewed them as well-meaning novices who needed British supervision. The real trouble didn't start with arguments about grand strategy. It emerged from something far more fundamental. It was about respect, or its complete absence. Beginning with their first meetings in North Africa, through the war's final days in Germany, American officers would learn that how Montgomery treated them revealed uncomfortable truths about what he believed regarding American fighting ability, American bravery, and American standing. None of these assumptions were flattering. March 6, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. Hot desert wind swept the sharp smell of scorched metal and destroyed equipment across the Tunisian landscape as Lieutenant General George S. Patton descended from his transport plane, arriving to take command of the battered II Corps. 20 days earlier, German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had attacked American units with devastating effectiveness in their first major confrontation with battle-hardened Wehrmacht troops. The outcome had been complete, stinging, and instructive. What Patton found waiting for him wasn't just a demoralized command structure. He encountered a British military apparatus that treated American soldiers as unreliable auxiliaries, needing strict British supervision. General Harold Alexander, the new British commander of the 18th Army Group, directing all Allied ground operations in Tunisia, had completed a detailed assessment of American combat performance that read almost like an accusation. American officers lacked combat experience. American soldiers weren't properly disciplined. American formations needed extensive British monitoring before they could handle significant military tasks. The report had some truth to it. Kasserine Pass had revealed real problems in American planning, American fighting methods, and how American units coordinated. However, Alexander's conclusions went much further. In Alexander's judgment, Second Corps belonged in supporting positions while British forces conducted the main operations. Patton grasped what was truly at stake. This wasn't simply about stopping Rommel. This was about establishing whether American soldiers could function as full partners with their British allies, not subordinates. His private writings during this time revealed his anger at British assumptions and his fierce commitment to demonstrate American capability through bold, aggressive fighting. Montgomery, commanding the British 8th Army, moving toward Tunisia from the eastern direction, represented everything about British attitudes that Patton despised. As the commander who had defeated Rommel at El Alamein, Montgomery carried himself with the assurance of someone who had transformed Britain's military fortunes in the desert. He had pursued Rommel across North Africa, using meticulous preparation and carefully orchestrated attacks that relied on massive material advantages rather than clever tactics. His soldiers respected him deeply because he won battles without throwing their lives away needlessly, but his bearing communicated that he possessed exclusive knowledge of modern warfare and that other commanders, particularly Americans, had substantial learning ahead. Alexander's battle plan for the final Tunisia operations reflected this view of the world. Montgomery's 8th Army would strike the primary blow against the Mareth Line, the defensive fortifications held by Axis forces in southern Tunisia. Patton's the Second Corps would execute supporting operations, drawing Axis strength away from Montgomery's decisive strike. Americans would shield Montgomery's assault, while the British earned the recognition that came with piercing Axis defenses and advancing into Tunis. Militarily speaking, the plan possessed merit. Montgomery's soldiers were veterans with a track record defeating German tanks. Patton commanded troops still acquiring battle skills, yet the way commands were parceled out signaled something beyond military practicality. It conveyed a hierarchy that would persist throughout the entire war. British forces leading the charge, American forces in supporting roles, British commanders receiving accolades while American accomplishments got overlooked or downplayed. Patton began his assault toward El Guetar on March 17, 1943, determined to demonstrate American fighting quality through violent, aggressive action. His orders mirrored his personality, mixing military direction with explicit demands for aggressive officer leadership. Officers would lead attacks from the front lines. American soldiers would channel the aggressive fighting spirit their ancestors had carried into the First World War. Regardless of what it cost, Second Corps would demonstrate it deserved recognition as a genuine combat force, not as troops assigned to garrison duty. The Battle of El Guetar became the vindication Patton needed. At dawn on March 23, 50 German tanks belonging to the 10th Panzer Division poured through mountain passages into a wide valley, launching an assault intended to smash through American defenses. What transpired shocked the German tank commanders. American artillery pieces, positioned with painstaking care to create overlapping zones of destruction, unleashed devastating salvos into the advancing panzer formations. Tank destroyers, situated to maximize natural advantages from the terrain, engaged German tanks at distances that wiped out the German advantage in firepower. When the day ended, the valley floor was covered with wrecked German vehicles, and the 10th Panzer Division had been stopped completely. This represented the first time American soldiers had beaten experienced German armored formations in direct combat. However, the accomplishment felt hollow for a troubling reason. Alexander's command center, absorbed in watching Montgomery's fighting at Mareth, barely noticed II Corps' success. British commanders continued sending detailed orders to Patton, supervising American operations with a level of control that kept signaling British doubts about American leadership. Even worse, Alexander kept changing the Second Corps' assigned objectives. altering tactical goals in patterns that appeared designed to keep American units subordinate to British operations. Patton received orders to advance, then stop. Attack with armor, then shift to infantry assaults. Each adjustment disrupted American plans. Each change confirmed that the Second Corps functioned mainly to support Montgomery's agenda, not to accomplish independent goals. When Montgomery finally struck the Mareth Line on March 20th, his initial frontal assault met stubborn German resistance and made minimal ground. He responded by wheeling his forces to attempt an encirclement, displaying the tactical flexibility that distinguished his best work. This shift required additional days, giving German troops opportunity to pull back and establish fresh defensive lines. When 8th Army at last broke through, the window for an aggressive pursuit had closed. Second Corps maintained its supporting attacks throughout central Tunisia, drawing German forces away from the British front. American units moved forward steadily, captured territory, and inflicted serious losses on Axis forces. Yet British newspapers and military reports scarcely mentioned these gains. Montgomery's triumph at Mareth dominated the coverage. Patton's contribution, critically important to the overall result, received bare mention. During the victory celebration in Tunis on May 20, 1943, when General Eisenhower, Alexander, and French General Henri Giraud reviewed marching troops, the speeches emphasized British and French accomplishments. American achievements got quick, dismissive reference. For American commanders, Tunisia held lessons that stretched beyond military tactics and supply questions. They understood now that operating with the British involved fighting for acknowledgement alongside fighting the enemy. They realized that Montgomery, regardless of his genuine military gifts, seemed incapable of viewing American forces as true equals, rather than junior officers requiring guidance. They began to wonder whether this attitude reflected merely Montgomery's personal nature, or whether it showed a broader British refusal to accept that power within the alliance had shifted decisively toward the United States. These bitter lessons would reappear when the Allies shifted their focus to the next target. Sicily, July 10, 1943. Gulf of Gela, Sicily. The greatest amphibious landing attempted to that date approached Sicily's shores through darkness and rough water as Operation Husky, the assault on Italy's principal island, commenced in the pre-dawn hours. 8 combat divisions, split between General Bernard Montgomery's British 8th Army and General George Patton's American 7th Army, landed on beaches running from Cape Scaramia down to Syracuse, in an undertaking that would test the limits of Allied cooperation as severely as it tested German and Italian defenders. The Operation Husky battle plan had sparked disagreement from day one. Early proposals scattered landing zones across Sicily, intending to seize harbor facilities quickly to guarantee adequate supplies for advancing troops. Montgomery found dispersed landings abhorrent. His North African experience had persuaded him that concentrated force was everything, that spreading troops too thin guaranteed piecemeal defeat. On April 24, 1943, he voiced his objections forcefully and laid out a competing approach. Land everything in Sicily's southeastern corner, giving 8th Army one straightforward mission: race north to Messina, the island's primary port on the northeast and the gateway into mainland Italy. Air Marshal Arthur Tedder and Admiral Andrew Cunningham, directing air operations and naval operations respectively, rejected Montgomery's proposal. 13 Axis airfields would remain operational under his plan, creating dangerous exposure for the invasion fleet. Naval vessels would cluster together in confined waters, sitting ducks for air assault. Both men carried tremendous authority. Their records proved their military judgment. Montgomery's response displayed the totality of his personality. He announced, with Churchill supporting him from London, that he would resign rather than carry out a plan he viewed as catastrophically wrong. Facing a crisis that threatened the entire invasion, Eisenhower convened a conference for May 2 to settle the argument. The gathering revealed divisions that would only widen before the war ended. Montgomery made his argument with confidence that teetered toward arrogance. Tedder and Cunningham held firm, emphasizing the dangers from active airfields and naval vulnerability. Eisenhower, trying to balance military reality against political concerns within the alliance, finally sided with Montgomery. Landings would concentrate in southeastern Sicily. 8th Army would drive toward Messina. 7th Army would shield 8th Army's left side. For Patton, receiving the finalized plan in North Africa while preparing his forces for amphibious assault, the meaning was clear as daylight. 7th Army had been assigned a backup role. Montgomery would handle the main operation. British forces would capture Messina while Americans protected their flank. Once more, American soldiers were being positioned in secondary roles while British commanders pursued triumph. The decision was troubling for reasons transcending Patton's well-known pride. American Mediterranean forces had multiplied considerably by July 1943. 7th Army included 3 infantry divisions, 1 armored division, and extensive supporting troops, roughly matching 8th Army's strength. American manufacturing was swamping Allied supplies with weapons and equipment. American fighters commanded Mediterranean skies. Yet the operational framework continued treating American forces as tools for British use. Patton's diary on July 12th revealed his bitterness with striking openness. Alexander and his all-British command staff had traveled to 7th Army headquarters to explain the operational strategy, a strategy that, in Patton's estimation, blocked Americans from any chance of reaching Messina. He noted with sharp sarcasm that Alexander, commanding both British and American troops, brought 0 American officers on his command staff. "What fools we are," Patton wrote, observing that American leadership had permitted command structures that guaranteed American forces would be sidelined. The actual landings went adequately well, setting aside the chaos of airborne assault that saw British and American paratroopers dispersed across the landscape, many perishing when transport gliders ditched into the sea. By first light on July 10th, both armies controlled their landing zones and were moving inward. Resistance from Italian coast defense units disintegrated rapidly. German counterattacks striking Patton's beachhead at Gela fell apart against strong American responses, naval artillery support, and aggressive defense by the 1st Infantry Division. Montgomery, convinced that German and Italian forces would crumble before his steady pressure, radioed Alexander that the road to Messina appeared open. His 8th Army would race directly up the eastern coast. Patton's 7th Army could stay defensive, maintaining 8th Army's security while Montgomery crushed what he assumed would be a demoralized foe. The message laid bare Montgomery's thinking. British troops would deliver the decisive blow. American troops would ensure safety. Events immediately complicated this neat picture. German defenders, far from collapsing, dug into strong positions using Sicily's mountainous landscape. 8th Army's momentum slowed, then stalled south of Catania, where German paratroopers held fortified terrain that funneled British assaults into deadly crossfire. Montgomery's patient, methodical approach, superb in open desert, ran into serious problems against defenders positioned on narrow fronts who could concentrate force in prepared positions. July 12th brought a signal from Montgomery to Alexander that would shape the remaining course of the war between the American and British partners. Montgomery proposed expanding 8th Army's operational territory westward, essentially appropriating a critical road assigned to 7th Army. The expanded zone would permit him to bypass German positions, pinning down his advance. American soldiers should pause, he suggested, and hold their ground defensively while 8th Army executed the offensive that would sever Sicily into 2 sections. The message's tone mattered as much as its substance. Montgomery did not request Alexander's permission. He announced his intentions and indicated that Americans should adjust their actions accordingly. The presumption was breathtaking. Montgomery was announcing plans to seize American territorial assignments, confine American forces to defensive holding positions, and pursue a design that guaranteed British forces would receive sole credit for Sicily's conquest. Alexander, whose personal regard for Montgomery exceeded his faith in American commanders, consented. July 13th brought an order from Alexander granting Montgomery the disputed road and telling Patton to maintain defensive positions while 8th Army advanced. American commanders reading those words received the message with absolute clarity. In the halls of power, decisions flowed from London as surely as from Washington. British preferences would shape how the Allies fought this war, regardless of what American forces could do or what American commanders wanted. When Patton received his orders, the fury inside him was immediate and white-hot. His diary became a confession of rage. Montgomery dismissed as an arrogant prima donna. Alexander branded an incompetent sycophant, willing to serve British interests above military sense. But Patton's words stayed in his private pages. In public, before Eisenhower and the chain of command, he accepted the order. He had to. Open defiance from commanders in the field would shatter the coalition, and Eisenhower couldn't afford that kind of fracture. Coalition warfare meant compromise, meant accepting decisions that burned like acid in your gut. It meant swallowing anger, even when you knew you were right. But Patton had no intention of letting 7th Army waste away while Montgomery grabbed all the glory and all the momentum. On July 17th, Patton walked into Alexander's headquarters carrying a map and an idea that would change everything. If Alexander wouldn't give Americans a starring role in this campaign, Patton would seize one. Instead of sitting back in defensive positions, 7th Army would drive northwest, straight toward Palermo, Sicily's capital and its lifeline to the outside world. The plan was audacious. One thrust would cut Sicily in half, trap Italian forces in the western portion of the island, and secure port facilities that would solve the endless supply headaches plaguing American operations. Alexander listened. Perhaps he was surprised by Patton's boldness, or perhaps he was simply relieved to see American energy pointed anywhere except toward Montgomery's territory. Either way, he approved it. That decision rippled through the entire campaign. The Allies were no longer executing one coordinated plan, but two separate races. Montgomery would continue his measured advance up the eastern coast toward Messina. Patton would blast toward Palermo, then wheel east and drive along the northern shore. What had started as a tactical adjustment became something fiercer. A personal duel between commanders, each determined to prove their army superior. Patton pushed his men with relentless intensity. These weren't soldiers taking a casual stroll through Sicily. They were fighting heat and punishing terrain, covering ground at speeds that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. Engineers rebuilt roads and bridges almost as fast as they were destroyed. Infantry marched through dust and exhaustion at a pace that left support columns gasping to keep up. On July 22nd, just 12 days after hitting the beaches, American troops rolled into Palermo. Sicily's greatest city was theirs. A major port facility was in Allied hands. Meanwhile, Montgomery was still grinding against German positions south of Mount Etna, making progress measured in yards per day, his advance increasingly seeming like a sideshow to what Patton was accomplishing. The Germans understood what the race meant. They couldn't hold Sicily anymore. Everyone knew that. The real question now was which Allied commander would claim Messina first, which army would own the symbolic trophy of victory. The race revealed character in ways that mere combat never could. Patton demanded the impossible from his soldiers and expected his commanders to deliver it. His senior officers, shaped by his style and his intensity, drove their divisions hard. The whole army moved like a coiled spring suddenly released. Aggressive, tireless, accepting risks that more cautious commanders would have rejected. Montgomery's 8th Army moved differently. They faced tougher opposition on ground that favored the defenders. British commanders, shaped by 4 years of fighting since 1939, with resources that grew thinner every month, refused to waste soldiers on reckless gambles. They had learned to measure progress in lives saved, not miles gained. They advanced methodically, professionally, and increasingly irrelevant to the campaign's outcome. The difference reflected deeper cultural divides between the armies. Americans had reserves of manpower and industrial capacity that seemed almost unlimited. They could afford to lose soldiers and still replace them, could risk bold moves because failure wasn't catastrophic. Britain had been fighting since 1939 with an economy growing more exhausted by the month, with manpower pools that never refilled. They couldn't afford the same gambles, but that calculation didn't matter to the generals. This had become personal. Montgomery's letters and his comments to journalists made clear what he really thought, that 8th Army's mission was the important one, that they faced the real enemy in the real terrain, that Patton's successes against weak Italians in secondary territory meant nothing at all. American commanders reading these assessments felt the sting of dismissal. They had heard it before in Tunisia. American success was always minimized. American setbacks were always attributed to inexperience. American officers were always portrayed as enthusiastic but untaught. The message buried beneath the courteous words was unmistakable. British respect for American military ability was conditional, extended only when American soldiers followed British officers and pursued British objectives. On August 17, 1943, soldiers from Patton's 3rd Infantry Division entered Messina hours before the British arrived. 7th Army had won the race. But the victory tasted hollow, emptied of meaning by Montgomery's response. The Field Marshal offered congratulations wrapped around subtle dismissal. 8th Army, he explained, had faced German professionals in defensive terrain. American troops had advanced against Italian amateurs in easier country. The newspapers picked up this narrative and ran with it. Reports celebrated 8th Army's desperate fighting while treating 7th Army's achievement as a footnote, a minor sideshow featuring inferior opposition. American accomplishments were noted almost as an afterthought, as if they somehow complemented British operations rather than standing equal to them. For American commanders reading these accounts in tents and headquarters across Sicily, the meaning was unmistakable. British storytelling would always center British victories no matter what the facts actually showed. The campaign left wounds that would never fully heal. American forces had proven they could move as fast as British forces, fight as hard, achieve results that matched or exceeded Montgomery's operations. Yet the recognition they received remained grudging and conditional, draped in qualifications and caveats. Montgomery seemed almost incapable of acknowledging that an American commander might possess skills equal to his own, or that American soldiers might deserve credit matching their contributions. Two ugly incidents made the poison between the commanders even more caustic. In early August, Patton slapped 2 hospitalized soldiers, accusing them of cowardice. When Montgomery heard about it, his response was a cold sniff of dismissal. This confirmed everything the British believed about American indiscipline and emotional volatility. A British commander would never lose control like that. A British officer would maintain proper composure. The second incident involved a young British Lieutenant Montgomery sent as a liaison officer to Patton's headquarters. The officer arrived with a cheap suitcase tied with string, his appearance shabby and unprepared. Patton had sent Montgomery an entire team, a colonel, a major, a full communications section, officers and equipment appropriate to an army commander's needs. In return, Montgomery had dispatched 1 junior officer with inadequate gear and no rank commensurate with the position. Patton sent the lieutenant back with a note explaining that he couldn't allow boys in a headquarters responsible for commanding an army. It was almost comic in its pettiness, yet it captured something real about how Montgomery treated his American counterpart. Patton commanded an army equal in size to Montgomery's 8th Army. Professional courtesy alone demanded that liaison officers match the rank and competence of those sent to 8th Army headquarters. Montgomery's failure to do so suggested he viewed 7th Army as subordinate, regardless of what official charts said about command relationships. As Allied planners began considering operations beyond Sicily, the invasion of Italy, then eventually the massive cross-channel assault into France, one reality had become undeniable. Bernard Montgomery saw himself as the supreme Allied battlefield commander and expected American officers to acknowledge that superiority through deference and subordination. That American commanders increasingly viewed Montgomery as the obstacle blocking any genuine equal partnership seemed not to trouble the British Field Marshal, or perhaps he simply didn't care. September 1, 1944 arrived with the war transformed. The Allies had shattered German defences in France. Since the D-Day landings, they had driven eastward through Normandy, liberated Paris on August 25th, in scenes of jubilation that made victory seem almost inevitable by year's end. From the beaches at Normandy all the way into Belgium, Allied armies chased German forces reeling backward across terrain where months earlier the Wehrmacht had seemed invincible. The German army appeared broken. Some commanders believed the war might end by Christmas. For Montgomery, now promoted and glowing in the reflected glory of Normandy's triumph, the moment demanded daring action. He had commanded all Allied ground forces during the invasion, a responsibility that combined with his earlier victories in North Africa and Sicily made him Britain's preeminent battlefield commander in the eyes of many. With German armies in chaos, he saw an opportunity for a single decisive stroke that could end the war. But September 1st also brought change that Montgomery despised. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, took direct control of all Allied ground forces. Montgomery, who had directed both American and British armies through the Normandy campaign, was now reduced to commanding 21st Army Group, just the British and Canadian forces. General Omar Bradley took the American forces, commanding 12th Army Group comprising 3 enormous American armies. The shift was inevitable. American strength in Europe now overwhelmed British numbers. American logistics kept the entire coalition supplied. American air superiority dominated every battlefield. American industrial power provided the material that made victory possible. The politics of the alliance demanded American command of a coalition that had become overwhelmingly American in composition. Montgomery understood the politics intellectually, but he accepted neither the necessity nor what it meant. Spreading command authority among multiple headquarters would dilute the decisive leadership victory required, he insisted. Eisenhower, whatever his political talents, lacked the battlefield experience to direct ground operations with any real competence. The Supreme Commander's job should be political and logistical coordination, Montgomery argued with increasing force. Operational command should remain concentrated in one pair of hands, someone with proven battlefield success, someone like Montgomery himself. He framed his argument as military necessity, but everyone understood who would benefit. Eisenhower's strategy, advancing into Germany on a broad front with multiple armies attacking simultaneously, was catastrophically wrong, Montgomery claimed. It dispersed resources, prevented decisive concentration, guaranteed the war would drag into 1945. His alternative was bold and self-serving in equal measure. The Allies should concentrate their forces for one powerful thrust through northern Germany. This thrust would cross the Rhine, seize the Ruhr industrial region, drive to Berlin before the Germans could organize new defenses. Montgomery would naturally command this decisive operation, with American forces providing support and protecting flanks. The military logic was debatable. A narrow salient deep into Germany would be vulnerable to flanking counterattacks. It meant abandoning operations elsewhere, allowing Germans to concentrate their remaining strength against the thrust. It depended on capturing bridges intact, maintaining supply lines across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, assuming German resistance had truly collapsed. But the political meaning was unmistakable. Montgomery was asking American leaders to subordinate their armies to British command for an operation that would ensure British forces, under British leadership, delivered the war's final blow. He wanted American troops to serve as his shield while he achieved his victory. He was demanding that Eisenhower surrender operational control to a subordinate who made no secret of contempt for the Supreme Commander's judgment. Eisenhower attempted compromise. He wouldn't concentrate all forces for Montgomery's northern thrust, but he would grant supply priority and authorize a limited Rhine crossing operation using airborne forces. Operation Market Garden would employ 3 airborne divisions to capture bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. British ground forces would then race across those bridges, establish a Rhine bridgehead, and position themselves for subsequent operations into Germany. To Patton and Bradley, Montgomery's scheme confirmed every suspicion they harbored. Once again, the Field Marshal was trying to push American forces into supporting roles while British troops grabbed the spotlight. He was demanding fuel that could sustain American advances deeper into France. He was proposing an operation whose risks seemed grotesquely out of proportion to potential benefits. Patton, driving Third Army through eastern France toward the Rhine, erupted in fury when he learned that his fuel allocations were being diverted to Montgomery. His army had proven in August that American aggression could achieve results that British caution never would. Third Army was approaching the German border, and yet Eisenhower was starving American operations to feed a British field marshal whose track record suggested methodical caution, not operational boldness. Bradley, more measured in his language than Patton but equally frustrated, understood the political reality. Montgomery made requests, threatened catastrophe if denied, and received priority regardless of American needs or accomplishments. Coalition politics guaranteed that British demands would be heard sympathetically, even as American forces provided most of the fighting strength. September 17, 1944, saw the largest airborne operation in history commence over Dutch fields. Over 35,000 American and British paratroopers dropped from transport aircraft, tasked with capturing bridges that German commanders were preparing to demolish. British ground forces from XXX Corps began racing north along a single highway, desperate to reach airborne units before German counterattacks destroyed them. The operation collapsed in disaster. Intelligence had detected German armor near Arnhem, but these warnings were dismissed as exaggerated. Airborne forces landed too far from their objectives, giving Germans time to organize defenses. The single highway became a shooting gallery, with British armor unable to move quickly or maneuver away from the road bordered by impassable marshland. German resistance didn't collapse. It intensified as Wehrmacht commanders rushed reinforcements to the threatened sector. At Arnhem Bridge, British paratroopers under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost held one end against impossible odds for days, waiting for relief that never arrived. XXX Corps, stalled by German counterattacks and unable to bypass destroyed bridges, never reached Arnhem. By September 25, when the operation was abandoned, the butcher's bill stood at over 17,000 Allied casualties. Roughly 6,400 paratroopers who had jumped at Arnhem were dead or in German captivity. The failure was absolute. The Rhine remained uncrossed. German defenses in the Netherlands solidified. The momentum that seemed unstoppable in early September dissipated across Dutch fields and along a highway the British would later call Hell's Highway. The opportunity to end the war in 1944 died with Operation Market Garden, which would prove to be Montgomery's greatest catastrophe. American reactions blended vindication with rage. Patton and Bradley had opposed Market Garden from the start, arguing that the risks far exceeded any conceivable benefits. They had suggested that resources Montgomery was demanding would accomplish far more if spent continuing American advances toward Germany. Their objections had been overruled by political necessity and Montgomery's stubborn certainty. Now that Market Garden had failed spectacularly, American commanders felt justified in their judgment. But satisfaction was swallowed by fury at Montgomery's response. Rather than accepting responsibility for an operation he had conceived, planned, and commanded, Montgomery characterized Market Garden as 90% successful. Bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen had been captured. Allied forces had liberated Dutch territory. That was enough for Montgomery to claim victory, regardless of what actually happened at Arnhem. Arnhem had failed to fall into British hands, yet this staggering disappointment was being dressed up as nothing more than a minor hiccup in an otherwise splendid success story. The audacity of this claim was simply breathtaking. Market Garden's whole purpose had been to punch a bridgehead across the Rhine. That hadn't happened. The operation had devoured over 17,000 soldiers' lives, killed or wounded, with absolutely nothing of strategic value to show for it. Yet Montgomery stood before the world declaring triumph, bending failure into victory through sheer force of his own magnetic personality. The American commanders weren't fooled for a second. They could see exactly what was happening. Montgomery was safeguarding his own reputation at the expense of honest accounting. When Montgomery won, the glory belonged solely to him. When things went wrong, he had a ready explanation for everything else. Never enough men, never enough supplies, never adequate backing. His own shoulders, though, somehow remained unclouded by any shadow of responsibility. But worse was coming. As the Allies transitioned into the grueling business of grinding forward against hardened German defenses, following Market Garden's collapse, Montgomery began taking public shots at Eisenhower's approach. In conversations with British newspapermen and in messages to Churchill, he complained that this broad front strategy was throwing away their chance for something decisive. Had they embraced his plan, had they given him the resources and authority he'd been asking for, the war would already be finished. What Montgomery glossed over were the inconvenient facts. Market Garden had actually received substantial resources. Its failure came down to something else entirely: faulty planning, poor intelligence, and drastically underestimating what the Germans could still do. But in Montgomery's retelling, operational mistakes transformed into a squandered opportunity created by others' short-sightedness. American commanders watched this performance and reached a troubling conclusion. Montgomery would never admit error. Victory was always his. Defeat belonged to someone else. This wasn't simply vanity. It suggested something more corrosive, something that made him genuinely hazardous to the alliance itself, an absolute incapacity to look honestly at himself, even as his battlefield abilities remained genuinely valuable. December the 16th, 1944. The Ardennes forest in Belgium. German forces launched their last massive western offensive at first light, smashing through the Ardennes in one final desperate roll of the dice meant to separate the Allies and grab Antwerp. They achieved total surprise, punching through American lines that were spread dangerously thin, creating a massive bulge in the defensive line that would name the entire engagement. For 10 long days, the outcome remained genuinely uncertain as German columns drove toward the Meuse River, threatening to shatter Allied defenses and drag out the war for months more. The Battle of the Bulge became Montgomery's best and worst moment all at once. Tactically speaking, his performance was outstanding. When Eisenhower handed command of American 1st and 9th Armies to Montgomery on December 20th, the Field Marshal moved immediately to restore order to defensive operations that had descended into chaos. He positioned British reserves to cover the Meuse crossings. He orchestrated American counterattacks methodically. He demonstrated under actual crisis conditions exactly why the British people trusted him with leadership. But what Montgomery did after the fighting ended poisoned feelings that would fester for decades afterward. On January 7, 1945, with German forces retreating in disorder and Allied victory no longer in question, Montgomery assembled the press. Officially, he'd gathered them to acknowledge American troops' courage and to support Eisenhower. What came out instead was a masterpiece of self-congratulation, dressed up as generous compliment. He started by recognizing American soldiers' bravery. Then he shifted. He began describing his own decisions immediately upon taking command, presenting them as crucial moves that prevented American forces from being overwhelmed. As soon as I took in what was happening, he explained, I undertook specific actions to make certain that if the Germans reached the Meuse, they would not cross it. He went on to describe how he had straightened out the mess, how he had thought ahead, how he had arranged everything properly. The battle, Montgomery concluded, had been most interesting, possibly one of the most complex and difficult battles he'd ever been responsible for. Throughout his remarks, British efforts got the spotlight. Montgomery's genius was underscored, and American commanders simply vanished from the account. It was calculation dressed as courtesy. He praised American fighting men while suggesting they'd required saving through his superior skill. He credited their courage while implying American generals had been paralyzed until British professionalism took over. And he characterized what had essentially been a desperate holding operation, something the 101st Airborne had done at Bastogne, what Patton had accomplished with his rapid wheel from the south, as fundamentally a Montgomery victory. American commanders reacted with shock and fury. Bradley saw the press conference reports and felt genuine betrayal wash over him. Montgomery had exercised authority over 2 American armies for less than 3 weeks. Those armies had fought with enormous courage, holding their ground against overwhelmingly greater force until the German momentum simply ran out of steam. Patton's Third Army had pulled off a stunning maneuver, rotating 90 degrees in midwinter to reach Bastogne. American soldiers had bled to stop Hitler's final throw of the dice, but Montgomery's version of events squeezed American achievements into shadows while casting his own role as essential. This wasn't simply ego, it was theft of history, an attempt to transform an American victory into a British rescue. And American commanders now grasped Montgomery's genuine conviction. He truly believed that showing up had saved them all. He couldn't see anything improper in taking credit for a triumph accomplished overwhelmingly by men he'd directed for less than a month. The press conference nearly broke the command structure. Bradley rang Eisenhower in a fury that abandoned all diplomatic pretense. He made a clear declaration. He told Eisenhower that he could not continue serving under Montgomery. If the Supreme Commander was giving the British Field Marshal lasting control of American units, Bradley would walk away. It wasn't empty talk. Bradley, ordinarily the most skillful American commander at political maneuvering, had simply snapped. Eisenhower grasped that the entire alliance was balanced on a knife's edge. He set out to soothe Bradley while drafting a private letter to the combined chiefs of staff. In plain language, Eisenhower stated that he would demand Montgomery's removal unless the field marshal offered a sincere apology and stopped his constant public needling. The war had been won, Eisenhower suggested, yet whether the partnership would survive victory remained genuinely uncertain. The standoff ended only when sustained pressure from London forced Montgomery to recognize the severity of his misstep. On January 12th, Montgomery penned a letter to Eisenhower expressing his regret and accepting that his press conference had created problems. To Bradley, he sent a measured note praising American troops and thanking them for the opportunity to command them briefly. The letters were courteous, apparently genuine, and ultimately pointless. The harm was already done. American commanders had now understood with perfect clarity that Montgomery would never accept them as true partners. Every operation would pass through his assessment of its effect on his standing. Every setback would get blamed on inadequate resources or somebody else's error. Every achievement would become evidence that Montgomery's judgment had been correct all along. This cycle was inevitable, predictable, and absolutely unacceptable. Yet beyond mere personality friction, something more significant was happening. By early 1945, the numerical balance in Europe had shifted so dramatically toward American strength that Montgomery's claims to battlefield supremacy had stopped being merely irritating and had become actively harmful to operations. American armies fielded more than 60 divisions. British and Canadian strength came to fewer than 20. American supply lines kept the whole coalition moving. American fighters ruled the European sky. Yet Montgomery persisted in acting as though British judgment must direct American muscle. The contradiction revealed something deeper about Anglo-American relations themselves. Britain, exhausted after 5 years of fighting and facing economic ruin after the war, struggled to accept that its epoch of dominance had ended. The United States, stepping into the role of world leader, was discovering that strength created obligations that American history had never trained it to handle. Montgomery became a living symbol of Britain's inability to accept that its world had fundamentally changed. Winston Churchill, observing Montgomery's press conference debacle unfold, understood the stakes. On January 18th, he rose in Parliament with carefully measured language aimed at repairing alliance relations. The Battle of the Bulge, he stated with absolute clarity, had been fundamentally American, an American success, and would go down as a magnificent American triumph. British forces had participated in a supporting capacity, as coalition partners properly should. The statement was diplomatic housekeeping, correcting Montgomery's narrative and acknowledging what the numbers actually meant. It also marked Britain's acceptance that the war's remaining phase would be primarily an American affair. British participation would continue. British soldiers would contribute. British commanders would share in victory. But American generals would increasingly make the decisions, run the campaigns, and take the credit their numerical superiority deserved. Montgomery, friendless after his own behavior and increasingly sidelined in a war now led by American strength, spent the remaining months commanding his 21st Army Group across northern Europe. His operations showed professional competence, his tactical instincts remained sharp, but the damage to his relationships with American commanders proved irreparable. Bradley avoided him. Patton held him in open contempt. Eisenhower put up with him because politics demanded it, though Eisenhower never again had faith in his judgment or his intentions. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered completely. The European conflict ended. Victory had come through an alliance that had beaten not just Nazi Germany, but also its own internal tensions that had repeatedly threatened to shred the partnership. In the rush of peace, these quarrels got temporarily forgotten. Montgomery was celebrated by a grateful British nation. American commanders came home to recognition of their accomplishments. But when memoirs and histories emerged after the war, the conflict surfaced again. Montgomery's published recollections from 1958 reopened old wounds by attacking Eisenhower and suggesting that Montgomery's strategic ideas had been superior all along. Eisenhower, now president, cut off personal relations, refusing to correspond with somebody apparently determined to relitigate battles from history's trash heap. Bradley's 1951 autobiography carefully catalogued moments when Montgomery's actions had damaged joint operations. Patton's diary, published after his death, showed the genuine venom he harbored for the British Field Marshal. American war accounts, drawing from these sources and from official records, painted Montgomery as capable but divisive, talented but unbearable, a commander whose value was genuine but whose character made him a problem for Allied cooperation. British historians constructed different narratives. They argued that American commanders simply failed to grasp his methodical style, his commitment to reducing casualties, his sophisticated thinking. They emphasized that Montgomery had never suffered a major defeat after taking command in North Africa. They highlighted how his careful planning had made D-Day work. They suggested American complaints reflected jealousy at British competence and resentment of British military culture. The arguments continued through decades of scholarship long after the principals had died. Historians debated whether Montgomery was actually great, whether American frustration made sense, how much personality mattered in military operations. Conclusions differed. Some described Montgomery as a fine commander who didn't belong in a coalition. Others suggested American generals, lacking Montgomery's background, simply resented his demonstrated superiority. Still others attributed the tensions to the natural strain of bringing powerful nations together in desperate circumstances. But underneath all the historiography sat an elementary observation that American commanders of the Second World War grasped with absolute certainty. Bernard Montgomery, whatever his gifts, could not regard American forces as real equals. Whether this reflected personal arrogance, cultural superiority, or Britain's attempt to cling to power in a changing world was debatable. What wasn't debatable was that Montgomery's conduct damaged the alliance and created needless difficulties for joint operations. The American experience with Montgomery became an education. Coming coalition operations got structured to avoid personality conflicts undermining military success. Command relationships got arranged to guarantee fair representation and keep any nation from dominating through simple confidence or inherited status. American military thinking absorbed a permanent skepticism about allies who mixed partnership with subordination. For American soldiers who fought beside Montgomery from North Africa to Germany, he symbolized what they imagined they'd left behind in 1776. The notion that British thinking must govern American muscle, that American enthusiasm wanted British experience to function properly, that New World vigor required Old World expertise to stay on course. They learned that tactical brilliance, industrial capacity, and military triumph couldn't overcome cultural assumptions running back through centuries of British global power. Montgomery never grasped this. Until his death in 1976, he maintained his wartime decisions had been sound, his objections justified, his strategic thinking superior. He stayed persuaded that Eisenhower had been a weak leader. American commanders had lacked his professionalism, and the war would have ended much sooner if somebody had listened to him. American survivors offered contrasting assessments. They granted Montgomery's tactical ability while questioning his strategic sense. They respected his preparation while pointing out that wars get won through daring as well as caution. They conceded his worry about casualties while noting that his hesitation sometimes let enemies slip away. They essentially agreed that Montgomery's temperament made coalition warfare more complicated than it required to be. Eisenhower delivered the final word, writing from perspective gained after years of distance. He granted Montgomery's gifts while identifying something fatal in the field marshal's makeup: a total blindness to the political side of running an Allied force. Montgomery was a man, Eisenhower observed, whose military accomplishment was indisputable, but whose shortage of diplomatic judgment rendered him inappropriate for senior leadership in coalition operations. It was perhaps the harshest possible assessment, not that Montgomery lacked ability, but that his strengths paled beside his weaknesses that betrayed his own side's cause. In coalition warfare, where personality matters as much as tactics or strategy, Montgomery's refusal to accept allies as genuine partners made him not just tiresome, but genuinely risky. Americans learned this through experience, from African deserts to German fields. They discovered that shared enemies alone don't build alliances. They require genuine respect, recognition of partners' accomplishments, and the capacity to put collective purpose above personal concerns. Montgomery lacked that capacity, and in that limitation lay the explanation for American animosity toward Monty. Not because of his nationality, not because of his cautious temperament, but because he forced them into the position of colonial subordinates in a conflict they were plainly winning. Warriors whose sacrifice counted, but whose wisdom didn't. Allies valuable only to the extent they served British interests. That resentment lingered past Montgomery, past the generation that soldiered alongside him, past the Cold War partnership constructed from wartime bonds. It stayed as a steady warning that raw skill cannot compensate for absent human decency, that tactical genius rings hollow when it damages partnerships that success required. Bernard Montgomery was numerous things: brilliant strategist, careful operator, celebrated British commander. But for Americans who served with him, he became something else, a permanent lesson about where military talent breaks down without diplomatic grace. The real question was never whether Americans saw his gifts. They absolutely did. The question was whether Montgomery could value theirs. He didn't. And that failure of character, more than any battlefield disappointment, produced a bitterness that shared victory never quite healed.